Hello and welcome. Hello and welcome to the July 13th edition of the Cluster API Provider AWS Office Hours, a subproject of both SIG Cluster Lifecycle and Cluster API. Please remember that this meeting will be recorded and posted up to YouTube afterwards. And this meeting does comply with the Kubernetes Code of Conduct. So in general, please be excellent to one another. To get started, it looks like we have at least one PSA. I think that was you that added it, Nadir.
Yep, so we just did an alpha release last week of 0.55. So that includes conditions and now been added to AWS Cluster and AWS Machine. The ability to support the customization of ingress rules for CNIs, and some changes to the subnet logic. So to include, so we can now deploy multi-AZ control planes, and also the rewrite of Cluster AWS ADM. Which has the new API. So yeah, so quite a lot of changes. So go check it out. We'll be doing a final release, or I'm not sure if we're going to do a release candidate and then a final release. Haven't thought about that yet. I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts.
Did you have any thoughts there, Andy?
So I know that I think we had one pull request for CAPI that we're waiting on at the last minute for 037. That's a very low risk pull request to let you change the init and join configurations, node registration options. We can do a release candidate if we want to, or we can just release 055, and if we find any issues, we can do 056.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think the release candidate is more important for the core cluster API since you need it to really test any of the providers. I don't necessarily know if we have to have them for the providers, but if anybody sees a need, then we can cut it. All right. And then moving on, looks like we have one group topic. Andrew with EKS implementation updates.
Yeah, good morning. I'll probably add this topic to the next couple of these. We kind of have a mini milestone going on in here. But yeah, so we have been working on the EKS Bootstrap provider. I think we'll be in a place where we can open a WIP PR at least today so people can kind of see what's going on. And then we can decide like what to merge when. We can do like half implementations or whatever, but we're pretty far along on the Bootstrap provider. The thing that kind of stops us from being able to test is, of course, a matching control plane provider to use. There are some hacks we were considering with just like making joining a pretend EKS cluster or something like that, but it largely works, and we're working on putting together the tests now. And then the other side, so half of our team is working on the AWS machine pool implementation that just started work at the end of last week. So we'll see what happens there. We're largely following patterns set by Azure in that space, so should be well aligned with what they're doing. Yeah, I think that's about it. Any questions?
I've got one. I guess, Jason, can you still not see hands that are being raised?
Sorry,
That's okay.
got distracted, but yes, go ahead, Andy.
So I think somebody from your team, Andrew, had a CAPI issue about the tilt providers file and wanting to support multiple providers. I added a comment sometime last week, I think, about trying to keep it backwards and forwards compatible to support either one or multiple, whether it's a hash or an array. I don't know if y'all had seen that.
Yeah, that was Mark, and Mark is here, at least per the participants list.
I just wanted to
Yes,
mention it because I know that y'all were had opened that at least.
yes, I have read the comment, but I have not addressed the issue yet because my startup knowledge it's almost new. But yes, thanks for the comment.
Okay, glad you saw it. Thanks.
All right, if there are no other questions about that one, looks like next is Richard with a cluster scope refactor.
Yeah, it's sort of related to what Andrew just mentioned. So I've done a refactor of the cluster scope and related services so that it can be reused between the current AWS cluster, AWS machines, and some future managed versions of those. I've tested it out with our implementation of the control plane, EKS control plane, just to see if it would work, and it does. So when this does merge in, I will then be able to create and update the work in progress PR for the EKS control plane with the new AWS managed cluster, based on the discussions we had last week about splitting that out and not having in the conditional logic within the current AWS cluster controller. So really just followed with this refactor, really just followed the pattern that the CapZ have introduced. So it's nothing new, I guess. So really, yeah, it'd be good to get that in at some point if possible, just so we can carry on with the control plane stuff.
All right, sounds good. Any questions for Richard? No.
I've got a sort of more general one about versioning. Do we want to try and target 0.6 for EKS support rather than looking at having it go in the 0.5 patch series?
I would expect it to be mostly experimental, similar to what is being done around the machine pool implementations over in Azure land. So I don't necessarily see a requirement that it be tied to 0.6, but if we did want to leave experimental, then I think that would likely be the case.
Yeah, I don't feel super strongly one way or another.
All right. Any other topics before we jump into the outstanding issues?
Just one comment on whether or not it goes into 0.6. So the Bootstrap provider is slated to be like all new YAML, all new pod. The question becomes, if we are to follow the pattern in CAPI, where there are individual YAML artifacts, but also there is an aggregate YAML artifact, I would be curious, like, maybe that artifact doesn't move into the aggregate until 0.6 or something like that. Just because, like, if you need the EKS control plane provider and the EKS control plane provider is experimental, you don't want to be in a weird spot with like the default YAML installing a controller that effectively doesn't do anything.
Oh, sorry. I think I just had a dog escape. So could somebody else take over for a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
I don't remember what we were doing with cluster resource set. Is that in the aggregated YAML upstream or in CAPI?
It is.
Okay.
It is according to I just pulled it down like minutes ago because I was thinking about this question, and I got the cluster resource set components.
Yeah, I know we have the feature gate disabled by default, and I guess we installed the CRDs, but if the feature gate's disabled, nothing happens. And I know we went back and forth on this.
Yeah, machine pool has been it's been installed by default for several releases now, and like it's been installed since before there were even any implementations of it.
Right. Yeah, I guess I think what we said was that the amount of effort it would take to put together all the combinations you might want that had either cluster resource set enabled or disabled would outweigh, like it's just way more work than is worth trying to deal with in our early alpha releases of cluster API. And so we compromised a little bit and said that we would have the feature gate be false by default because it's a new experimental feature, and the CRDs would get installed by default in that aggregate YAML because it was too hard to split it out. So maybe we do something similar. Like you could split out I guess you could have one YAML for EKS and another YAML for what we currently have, and then an aggregated one that's got them all together if we really wanted to. Although I don't know, would somebody want to be doing both in a single management cluster?
Yeah, I mean, so that's an interesting question. I definitely think there will be a couple of cluster CTL, like maybe tweaks, only because like well, maybe not cluster CTL, but you're certainly not going to install, well, I don't know how I feel about two control plane providers, like how that's going to go, like how well they would work together.
They should be
and
all
I
right.
can only speak from the self-managed, where it's very hilarious. But yeah, I mean, I think they could play well together. I would also love to try and join EKS nodes and kubeadm nodes to like the same control plane. It just wouldn't work. But once again, I realize I've totally forgotten about the management cluster use case, which is 90% of all use cases. So
Yeah, and with regards to multiple control plane controllers, I don't know if there's anything in cluster cuddle specifically that would need to change, but the APIs are designed to support multiple in the same management cluster because we have the control plane ref from the cluster to the actual instance of a kubeadm control plane or an EKS control plane. And presumably the individual control plane providers won't be bothering to deal with clusters that don't link to them for the type of control plane it is. Maybe Andrew, I haven't looked at the issues in Kappa lately, but it's probably worth creating an issue that just says we need to figure out how we're going to package Kappa going forward for plane versus EKS, and we can just brainstorm in there.
I think some of this might actually overlap into like core cluster API too, because I suspect we're going to have similar questions like this for the other providers as well, especially the Azure provider and how they want to expose around the ability to do AKS clusters in a similar way.
cool. I'm opening up that issue now. We did not get into issue triage or anything like that yet, Jason, just so you know.
Sounds good. If you want to pass over privileges to me, I can take back over for that.
Cool. Let me figure out how to do that. Make co-host.
Yeah, that'll work. Sorry, in my rush out to figure out what was going on, I transferred host instead of co-host. All right.
Aha.
Let me go ahead and share my screen. So hopefully that's working now. Get up. And the participant
it's good.
list is still blank. So if anybody raises their hand, I might not be able to see it. So let's go into the issues. That's not what I wanted. I wanted to do the issues with no milestone. Oh, we got a few. All right. I can see quite a few of these are related to the EKS issues. Wonder if I can select all and apply a milestone there. So for these, I don't think we're gonna try to get any of them in for 055 at this point, but I will go ahead and put them in the milestone for 05X for now. Did that work? Okay, good. All right, so, and the refactor, cluster scope, EC2 service, I think that's gonna fall into the same bucket. And prevent control plane nodes being distributed across local and regional AZs. This one is Unidir.
Yeah, it's just something we need to defend against. That I can't see why anyone would want to have them distributed that way. It only affects US West 2 if you opt into it at the moment, so it's not high priority.
All right, so. So we can make long-term for the milestone. Are you thinking that's something that we need to solve in the 05X timeframe, or should we target like?
Yeah, 05X. It's not it should be fairly simple.
All right, sounds good. Enable goer 113 linter. And I think Ben is out today. Does anybody have any strong thoughts or opinions around this?
Either a long-term or backlog with next.
Yeah, I think the title might bury the lead a little bit. There's basically like an errors refactor hidden in here, isn't there?
Yeah. To actually meet the requirements of it, we need to change up the way that we're doing errors almost completely. And I think help wanted is probably appropriate here. I'm going to leave off good first issue because it is not really trivial. All right, improve AWS controller testing.
Sorry, I should have said AWS cluster controller testing. I did a quick coverage on it and it's fairly low. I know that the AWS machine controller has some unit testing. So I just made an issue for having something similar for the cluster one.
All right, and I think long term's probably appropriate here. Anybody have opinions on milestone for this one?
Next.
Yeah, I think that's how I was leaning as well. All right, and then re-enable multi-AZ E2E testing. And I think Gab and Nadir, you were talking about this earlier today.
Yeah, so as soon as you run Jinko with more than one node, it's gonna have problems if you don't with the default account limits. So we decided to pivot from doing it on existing E2E testing to doing it, if we're going to do it on the new cluster cuddle framework based testing and dedupe some of these tests, so we've got less individual clusters being built and maybe some external lock to be able to serialize Jinko a bit, which you can't do within Jinko by default.
And this is related to the relatively low default limits that the Boscos accounts are running with.
Yeah, so elastic IPs in particular, and the default limit is 5. So, and if you're doing multi-AZ testing, you're going to have 3 straight off. So 2 clusters is enough to break.
And that's not including the elastic IP that gets associated with the load balancer.
Yeah. So it's 1.1 clusters.
Yeah. I do think that serializing some of these out is a good, relatively short-term solution. I think we probably also want to look at potentially seeing what we can do about increasing the limits in the for the Boscos accounts. But we would need to work with Justin Santa Barbara to sort some of that out.
Okay.
So I went ahead and I put priority important soon on here because I do think we want to have testing around the defaults. I don't necessarily know that this needs to be a blocker for 055 though. So I'm tempted to make it 05X. Does anybody else have thoughts for the milestone here?
That sounds good to me.
All right. I think that takes care of all of the issues. We can take a look at any of the pull requests as well. All right, the cluster scope one. All right, we said that one was going to be 05X. Migrate the rest of the EDE tests to use the cluster cuddle framework. Is this something that we should get in for 055 or what's the current state of the EDE tests right now?
So I'm actually doing the work to kind of like dedupe them. And it's also blocked on Nadir's PR, which I can't find here.
It's merged. It's in.
Oh, perfect. Great.
All right. So for the current state, is this something that we really need to get in for 055, or is this something that can land after that?
I think it can land after. It's not. We do have tests. They're running. We've done lots of local validation as well. So yeah.
Makes sense. The validation around fields. I don't necessarily think this is anything that is a blocker for 055. So I will go ahead and do 05X there. Bring your own control plane subnets.
I think we're still waiting, unless it's been updated recently, we're still waiting on Andrew to respond to the feedback Nadir put in there.
Yeah. All right. So I will go ahead and I think let's get this one 05X and then AWS multi-tenancy. I know this is going to be somewhat of a larger change. Is this something that would likely target 05X, or is this something that we should probably look towards 0.6 for?
I think 0.6 is probably fine.
All right, sounds good to me. Okay. The EKS control plane, I think we said 05X for that. There's one for etcd EBS volumes.
So I
this
think
is
this was waiting on the CAPZ, well, Cecile to write that KEP. And I think Matt has maybe is not available at the moment to work on it, but I'm not sure.
all right. And I don't remember any breaking changes there, so I can tentatively put it in 05X for now. And if we need to shuffle it later, we can. And then fix error links. This is one of the older ones that I think was just, the link might have been pointed to the wrong place. So
Might be worth just adding a comment to
yeah.
see if they're still available.
All right. So I think that takes care of both the PRs and the issues without any milestone. Is there anything else anybody would like to ask or discuss before we call this one? No? All right. Well, thank you all very much, and we will see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks.